Good afternoon. I'm Shawn Miller, and I'm coming to you from my office in Provo, Utah, as I'm not yet in Munich, but I expect to be there by the end of this week. It's my pleasure to be with you. I'm grateful to the Carson Center for inviting me. I don't know how well I'm going to engage a lone camera here, but I'll just double down and read to you. So at least if I'm not engaging, I might be coherent. I've entitled my presentation today, Dreams and Realities on the Unfinished Pan American Highway. The journalist Lee White confessed that he, quote, had long cherished the not very original idea of driving all the way down to Argentina. The Pan American Highway, the America's greatest joint venture, beckoned him, as it did many others, to follow its sinuous path south through dramatic landscapes and exotic cultures. White intended to take his wife along and get on the road, quote, before too many people beat me to it. He did concede that in 1951 he was already rather late to become a Pan American Highway pioneer. Many had embarked before him, their travels widely publicized. But a personal adventure to South America was sure to offer material worthy of an article or two for publication. To commence his planning, he inquired in person at the Pan American Union Building in Washington, D.C., the grand marble edifice that overlooks the White House. Among the building's occupants were those who had been intimately connected to the planning and promotion of the Pan American Highway. The reception directed White to the Union's travel division, whose assistant chief, Luis Rivera, told White, with the conviction that came from having said the same thing many times before, "You will never make it." White protested. Had he not heard of Brazilians and Argentines who had driven up from South America in late model Fords and old Chevrolets? Didn't Richard Sullivan during the war promote a brand new Plymouth sedan by driving it from Detroit to Cape Horn? And in fact, wasn't the Latin American press covering at that very moment the Echauri family's drive from Paraguay in a 1927 Model T Ford to settle in New Jersey with their son, Henry Ford Echauri, who was born during that trip? Rivera summarily dismissed them all. Nobody, he said, has ever driven from South America to North America or vice versa, and I don't think anyone ever will, not in our lifetimes. All claims of automotive victory over the Pan American Highway, Rivera explained, were outright fictions or had omitted substantial detours by sea or by rail. It could not be done. In consolation, Rivera suggested if White were truly determined that he should buy a four-wheel drive truck, leave his wife at home, hire a resourceful mechanic as driving companion, White was sure to have an adventure, Rivera granted, as far as the road might take him. How had he been so badly informed, White wondered, 3 decades after the idea of the Pan American Highway had been announced, after millions spent on public works and private contractors, after the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had bulldozed hundreds of miles of jungle in Central America as an emergency war measure to defend the Panama Canal? How was the highway still not finished? And more significantly, how could he have not known? Disillusioned, White gave up his dream. Rather than make a journey that promoters described as one of infinite possibilities, he had found his story in the finite possibility of an unfinished road. We are now a century from the idea, or the birth of the idea of the Pan American Highway, first proposed in 1923 at the 5th Pan American Conference. However, neither the aspirations to drive the highway nor ignorance about its status have substantially changed since White's day. Many still want to travel the famed route, and many are still aware that they will never make it. The highway remains unfinished and it's still impassable. Most of the breaks have been filled, but the Darien Gap abides. And Colombia and Panama are the only bordering nations on Earth that do not have an automotive connection of even the most primitive kind. The Pan American is not the world's longest highway, as it continues to be touted in the annals of world record societies. Unlike White, many today who venture for another American continent do not inquire about the highway status before they leave. And why should they? The automobile has conquered the world, connected everything. Automotive infrastructure is so ubiquitous it can be described as unremarkable, even invisible to many of us. Most Americans have no specific knowledge of bridges over the Mississippi River, nor of parking lots in national parks, but they go forth in full faith that every terrain will welcome their private vehicles with public amenities, including easy passage and free storage. And hence, every year Americans respond to the Pan American Highway's call, drive south into the literal unknown, and suffer the shock of an unexpected dead end. Panamanian officials are frequently confronted by bewildered drivers sputtering a sincere and non-rhetorical, "What do you mean there ain't no road?" Many have forgotten the fate of the Pan American Highway because its fate was failure. The standard and scale of success for modern infrastructure was defined as early as the 1870s by Walt Whitman, and I quote, "Lo soul, seest thou not God's purpose from the first? The earth to be spanned, connected by network, the people to become brothers and sisters, the lands to be welded together." We rarely forget our triumphs. More than 600 books have been published on the history of the Panama Canal, a narrative whose finale at each telling pats us on the back for fulfilling Whitman's prophecy. The canal's completion celebrates our technical prowess, the conquest of nature, and a revolution in transportation, accomplishments that we think worth retelling. Our failures we tend to neglect. The Pan American Highway was to be the land equivalent to the Panama Canal, two great infrastructural projects crossing in Panama to weld the big world together. But to date, only one book has attempted to address the Pan American Highway's history, a recent entry that tellingly devotes more than half of its pages to topics other than the highway. Of course, many books narrated travels on the Pan American Highway on foot, bike, horse, motorcycle, and bicycle, accounts that tantalized and deceived individuals like White, but such travelogues focused on the road's difficult present and its propitious future. They were uninterested in the highway's past. Edwin Warley James led the U.S. effort to build the highway. For 23 years, most of them lived in Latin America. The MIT-trained engineer and self-taught diplomat worked out of posh offices occupying an entire floor of Costa Rica's best hotel. He controlled tens of millions of dollars earmarked for the highway's completion. The Pan American was his baby, and nobody did more to promote its promises and push for its progress. However, as his career progressed, he became increasingly pessimistic about the highway's future, exclaiming in the early 1950s that the highway was not likely to be finished in another 100 years. And he asserted even earlier that until it is a completed thing, quote, the history of the highway may not be written, suggesting that one could not reasonably write the history of something that did not yet exist. Such a concern has not prevented authors from trying. James himself, a Harvard history undergraduate, was disingenuous because he wrote the highway's first history in 1939. And a number of scholars across the Americas have produced excellent dissertations, manuscripts, and theses pretty much every decade about the highway's history and its origins and its progress. No press, however, saw fit to publish any of them. James' manuscript offered an intimate and entertaining account, and he tried to the end of his life in 1967, at the age of 90, to get his history published without success. Both winners and losers can write history, but to amend an old adage, it's the winners who tend to get published. This attempt at writing the highway's history seeks to answer a number of related questions. First, rather than skirt the reality of the highway's incompletion by projecting its success into the future, this narrative embraces that failure. Why have we forsaken the most publicized public works project in the Americas, leaving a gap at its middle about 100 kilometers in extent? To answer, one must investigate the mixed motives that drove the highway's construction, as well as the varied obstacles that thwarted it. What motives, whether broadcast or concealed, did the highway's many backers embrace for why the road had to be built? And what obstacles, political, topographical, cultural, and environmental, hampered the highway's progress and its ultimate completion? One must develop the argument over the long century of the highway's construction, because both motives for and obstacles against the project evolved every decade. Who wanted it built and what stood in the way in the 1930s differed markedly from who wanted it built and what stood in the way in the 1940s, for example. Beyond the highway's construction, we will not neglect the highway's consequences. We will treat the highway as a case study of the impacts of road building in the developing world. Nearly all highway histories are ascension narratives, and we need more nuanced accounts. In addition to the builders of the highway who have received most of the attention, even in the unpublished works, We must examine the highway's receivers, its users, and its victims. Aside from the belief that the highway is finished, an upright history also has to address the highway's biggest myth, which is that there is a Pan-American highway at all, finished or not. In reality, there's never been a Pan-American highway, at least as the idea of the highway exists and existed in the popular mind. Officially, the highway was not planned as a prominently signed route marked on every map that would run single file from Alaska to Patagonia. The highway, rather, was to be a network of roads whose purpose was to link every national capital from Ottawa and Washington to Santiago and Buenos Aires and everything in between. Even Havana was to be included by car ferry. These were objectives no single line could hope to accomplish, and the network remained the official plan throughout construction. In fact, in 1966, just after the highway reached the Panama Canal, the Federal Highway Administration declared the entire U.S. interstate network as part of the Pan American Highway System, but nobody noticed. The highway's promoters understood from the beginning that pitching a highway network such as the U.S. interstate system would never capture the human imagination like a single named route. The U.S. system of gridded numbered freeways, I-5 and I-70 as examples, a system Edwin James invented and labeled, simply did not have the draw of a famed and named single route such as the Silk Road or the Lincoln Highway. Hence, from 1928, the Pan American Highway, singular, became the branding myth upon which popular and political support for the system's construction was to be built. Responses, for the most part, were enthusiastic. A single line found some resistance among Latin American leaders who wanted to connect to their own frontiers and not so much to Alaska. But even they found the single route their most effective pitch to their own citizens. Indeed, the idea of the single named route became one of the most potent symbols of Pan-Americanism itself. And car makers pitched it to sell cars, road builders to win contracts, diplomats to keep friends, and politicians to win votes. But it was mostly a lie. Locating the highway is difficult. You will find stretches officially named Panamericana in Central America and in some Andean states. However, there's no official named or signed Pan American Highway in Canada, in the United States, in Mexico, or in most of the countries of South America. The Pan American Highway is more idea than reality. Those who claim to drive it must persuade themselves that they are someplace that they are not, and to travel the supposed highway from end to end is as much a feat of imagination as it is endurance. While the Pan American Highway as a continuous traversable route is a failure, road building in the region, if mileage is your measure, has been a massive success. With a couple of exceptions, most of the hemisphere's landmass is now accessible by car, and the history of road building in the region has only just begun. By 2050, global road mileage is projected to increase 60%, a dramatic 25 million more kilometers of highways. 90% of this growth will be built in developing nations. So after 120 years of expansion, automobility still grows at a rapid clip. Road building is essentially part of our DNA. We are built to move. We have had to transpose our bodies from place to place to find food, flee perils, and to woo exogenous reproductive partners. Most landscapes are not easy to traverse, even on foot. Mountains, forests, swamps all pose substantial barriers, and even deserts and grasslands are not often amenable to easy walking without significant amendments. Our first roads then were literal beaten paths, most of them created by non-human mammals who were also moving in search of sustenance, safety, and sex. The first roads emerged under the tread of hooves, only to be followed later by human feet. Ironically, we found it possible to improve our roads only after we settled down. But from the beginnings of civilization, humans began to straighten their paths, remove trees, grade slopes, and build bridges. We also began to pave some of our roads, not so much to smooth the ride because most still walked, but to mitigate mud and prevent vegetation from taking back the path too quickly. The great land empires built and maintained roads, the Roman, the Inca, the Maurya, and the Han, notable for the size and extent of their networks. In another 10,000 years, if our species both survives and remains interested in those who came before them, Our age is likely to be remembered as that of the road builders. If their ubiquity has made them unremarkable to our eyes, our collective automotive roads are the most extensive and arguably the most expensive work humans have ever built. And they are likely to outlast most of our more ostentatious creations, our towers and bridges. There are now more than 40 million kilometers of public roads in the world. From its beginning as game trails, the current road network circles the Earth 1,000 times, could make 110 trips to the moon, or offer the possibility of a one-way family road trip to the orbit of Venus. However, to think of roads as merely mileage, lines of one dimension, misses their spatial impacts. Roads are long, but they are also wide. With an average breadth greater than 10 meters, current global roads cover a combined area more than 400,000 square kilometers, a sheet of contiguous pavement overlying a plot of ground about the size of California. But it's the road's depth that will account for its longevity, and maybe more importantly, its long-term legibility. Roman roads built up of 4 more distinct layers of rock are as much as 1.5 meters thick. Modern roads, particularly highways, are often much deeper in cross-section and have multiple identifiable strata. Indeed, a strictly modern definition, material definition of a modern road would be a bonded aggregate pavement, asphalt or concrete, laid on a foundation of multiple layers of crushed rock. When we build a road, we excavate existing geological strata and replace it with carefully engineered layers, sometimes to a depth of many meters, particularly when the underlying geology is inappropriate to support a road's traffic. Our roads, then, are an intentional stratigraphy that becomes permanently logged into the geological record. If geologists are looking for geological evidence to date the inauguration of the Anthropocene, that is stratigraphy, our global network of roads might serve as one of the signal markers. Because we've built roads over a few thousand years, they might not make the most precise marks in time, but what are a few thousand years among geologists? Geology has shaped the Earth in part through cataclysms of magma, water, and ice. Highways are man-made linear geological cataclysms, the literal displacement of existing strata by the use of drills, explosives, excavators, dozers, and scrapers, and then filling in those man-made voids using rock crushers, front loaders, graders, compactors, and pavers. These transformations are likely to last if dinosaur footprints, evidence of the earliest beaten paths, survive hundreds of millions of years after their printing, evidence that requires unique conditions to be fossilized. Surely some of our automotive roads, which are already rock, will stand as long, the most legible evidence of our passing. Regardless of the road's longevity, its impacts on the past are what concern us here. Our global road building project has led to the proliferation of the automobile, which was the democratization of the motor and of the Industrial Revolution itself. Roads permit us to place very large machines into the hands of everyday drivers, each entrusted with an excess of 100 horsepower for extreme mobility and unprecedented spatial access. Today, there are 1.4 billion registered vehicles. That many large machines have many direct consequences. Altogether, transportation, much of the world produces more CO2 than any other economic sector, making internal combustion the largest contributor to global warming. More directly, through constant collisions, cars on our automotive networks speed along at about 250 lives per hour. According to the World Health Organization, vehicles kill 1.3 million persons every year. And if cars have been heedless of human life, they've been rapacious toward other living things. As early as the 1960s, it was estimated that just in the US, cars were killing 1 million animals per day, including invertebrates. In Brazil, vehicles kill 500 million creatures every year, including 2 million mammals and 8 million birds. Much of the rest of the automobile's environmental legacy may be more indirect, but it is no less remarkable. Roads are arguably the major proximate cause of most of the other marks we will leave. In a world without automobility, human impacts must have remained relatively puny because we simply cannot reach, harvest, or carry away resources on any scale with just our hands and our feet for tools. Rail had great capacity, but it had limited reach, and its direct users were limited to its private owners and their customers. Roads, on the other hand, are uniquely accessible in their almost universal status as public spaces. Also, unlike rail, roads are highly contagious. A single highway commonly begets hundreds of others, as has the Pan American. As a result, the world has moved inexorably toward roadedness. In the United States, 80% of the land is within 1 kilometer of a road. That's the contiguous United States. And 20% is within 125 meters. In many developed nations, roads now have greater systemic reach than rainfall. While there are 5.3 million kilometers of streams and rivers in the U.S., there are 6.3 million kilometers of roads. Roads open the gates to the powers of automobility, and only after we build roads can we, on any significant scale, fell forests, dig mines, drill gas or oil, establish plantations, introduce cattle, dam rivers, or build suburban homes, etc. If these marks will be more fleeting than the roads themselves, they are nonetheless the most apparent features of living in the Anthropocene. Road density is usually correlated with dense populations. The exceptions include areas of oil and gas drilling and logging operations. The takeaway is that most modern roads are built to access untapped resources more than they are built to get from existing points A to existing points B. And this was also true of the Pan American Highway. Wilderness proponents understood from the 1930s that limiting roads was their most effective strategy. The Sierra Club understood this as well in the 1970s when, to protect the diverse forests of the Darien, they sued the U.S. government and temporarily blocked the completion of the highway just as it seemed within reach. The Pan American Highway is a fruitful space from which to consider the place of roads in the modern world. As a popular idea and a joint construction project that persisted for much of a century, it exhibits the changing consensus, controversies, and consequences of roads like no comparable linear space. The simple fact that the road remains incomplete opens us to questioning the very project of automobility, its meanings, impacts, and ultimately its necessity. It invites us to question the roads we continue to project and even to consider closing some we have already built. To protect habitats, species, and diversity, road control must be part of the solution, to act before the arrival of surveyors. This is particularly true in nations where governance along new roads has proven weak. A targeted policy of preventing new roads has been called the, quote, sleeping giant of conservation ecology because it has still received little attention. The road's full history may remind us of the future costs of continuing down this well-beaten path at this increasingly rapid pace. Let me conclude with the Pan American Highway's most repeated myth, the one that spoke to our better selves. This was the dream that the highway would form a shared ribbon of asphalt, a sort of linear commons, linking the Americas into a brotherhood of republics. Some went so far as to suggest a relationship not unlike the European Union, where borders, for most purposes, became meaningless. A few who followed the road took up that dream, not just crossing borders and conquering space, but to try and see and understand another American, to make the, quote, good neighbor something more than a slogan. They made the myth real at an individual scale. The experience for most who moved along the road, however, was different. The facility and reality of the highway's movements made many question this rather fraternal definition of neighborliness. And the very presence of the highway, in fact, hardened rather than blurred the borders. After the U.S. pulled out of building the road, Panama and Colombia continued to, toward their shared border, seeking the gap's final closure, but they could not bring themselves to finish. For the final obstacles of the highway's completion is no longer environmental nor technical, but cultural, an intolerance and fear of foreign migrants. Today, the Darien Gap serves as Panama's border wall. Like most walls, it's not terribly effective, and thousands walk through it every year, but it remains politically expedient to Panamanians who oppose more Colombian migration. Over the course of a century, the Americas have given up on the Pan American Highway's rhetorical objective of hemispheric unity. Roads remain as popular as ever, and ideas, money, and commodities flow across borders with little resistance, but not people. At the end of the Pan American Highway's first century, nearly all American nations have concluded that good fences, rather than good roads, make for good neighbors. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.